Hello again, everyone. Tom Degorski in the Cipher Brief virtual studio. Good to have you with us. We continue to take stock of all the developments, startling developments that continue to spill out almost on a daily basis involving the United States and Russia and Ukraine, the war, and so forth. The latest is another major story on this front. The United States saying that it has, for the moment, cut off major parts of its intelligence sharing arrangements with the Ukrainians. Arrangements that presumably have been in play, we don't know for sure, for the better part of the 3 years of this war. Specifically, any help identifying targets inside Russia. The Financial Times reports that while some informal sharing of intelligence is continuing, nothing more that involves time-sensitive or high-value intelligence. Joined today by someone who knows a thing or two about high-value intelligence, John McLaughlin, longtime CIA official who led the agency as its acting director and a frequent contributor here at the Cipher Brief. John, let's start with that latest news, if we could. I think most people might understand what it's like when a weapons shipment is stopped at the border. It's not coming in. We have this pause of weapons from the United States going to Ukraine. Help us to understand what a pause in intelligence sharing might look like if you're a commander or anybody else involved in the fight inside Ukraine.
Well, Tom, thank you very much. Good to see you. Essentially, a pause in intelligence means that we are, by that, limiting the visibility of the battlefield for the Ukrainians. Not clear to what extent or how long. Director Ratcliffe's latest statement indicates that it apparently will resume at some point, but indirectly affirms that it has been stopped. It sounds from the reporting you read as though what's been limited is the kind of intelligence that applies to what we would call current intelligence, the sort of thing that applies to what is happening at the moment, either on the outgoing side, that is targeting of Russians, or the incoming side, that is to say the Ukrainians' ability to see the Russians on the battlefield, to see how they're moving, to see what their strength is, and so forth. And if something's continuing, it's probably what we would call order of battle intelligence, which is essentially the disposition, size, strength of the opposition, and so forth. But it sounds like they've stopped the kind of thing that is used in day-to-day combat.
So can I ask you on this outgoing incoming distinction you made? I suppose you could understand if you are presenting yourself, you being the United States, as a broker now to try to get to a deal, which the Trump administration obviously is trying to do between Ukraine and Russia. It might stand to reason that you don't at the same time want to be providing intelligence on the outgoing that you mentioned for a strike, let's say, that could damage a lot of targets, individuals, whatever, inside Russia tomorrow or while this process is going on. But then the incoming then means you're also opening the door or making it easier, presumably, for the Russians to have success on a strike coming in. Is that about right?
Yes, and it's shocking. To me, it's shocking to hear the United States saying that it is limiting intelligence to an ally, a partner, someone we've supported up till now, because there's nothing we can do to limit Russian intelligence on Ukraine. In fact, they will keep their intelligence missions flowing fully, and it exposes Ukraine to Russian weaponry and targeting at a time when their ability to retaliate is diminished. Those of us who've been involved in sharing of intelligence are having trouble getting our heads around this. You don't do this to a partner who is involved in a fight. In fact, thinking back, when I used to array our priorities, your number one priority was always support to our forces in combat or the forces of allies in combat.
Mm-hmm.
It had to be ahead of everything else because you're talking essentially protection of life. So I suppose we are trying to emphasize that it's limited, but it's not done. Just not done when a partner is in battle.
Now, what about, again, to the practical terms here? So if you are a U.S. intelligence officer
Yeah.
who has been working with Ukrainians for however long, and you
This
get
is very difficult to implement.
that's what I was going to ask. You get an order like that, do you just stop talking to your counterparts?
Well, we don't know the particulars, but without very specific guidance from the director or headquarters, intelligence officers in the field and at headquarters, because not all of the sharing is done in the field. A lot of it is done remotely, uh, particularly for sensitive signals intelligence. Um, the people who are in charge of actually passing that intelligence would need very specific instructions about what to pass and what not to pass. If they're not given those instructions, they've got to make some very difficult decisions, which would be hard both practically and morally.
Hmm.
You've been accustomed to supporting an ally whose lives are in danger, and you have to decide, well, what am I going to hold back and with what consequences?
Right.
And I think that's a very difficult position to put people in. Now, that said, of course, there are things that we may not be giving them routinely anyway. So there's a category of intelligence that maybe has never been on the table
Hmm.
because of its sensitivity. But the important thing is, with whatever we're giving them, something is coming away. And how you make those decisions and how you implement those decisions strikes me as very, very hard to do it in a way that is sensible, morally comfortable, and so forth.
Now, we asked of many of our experts, and the world is asking in the wake of the pause on weaponry and equipment from the United States, to what extent the Europeans might come in and help fill the gap. Again, totally different issue here, but what can you say about presumably European intelligence services can see things too? We're not the only ones. And to use your phrase, I think you called it current intelligence. So let's say it's frozen for the moment from the United States. Can the Ukrainians still get the benefit of whatever the British, the French, whomever are seeing that picks up the slack or fills the gap?
Yes, the only thing is, there are certain things that only the United States can provide in terms of volume and precision and sensitivity and speed.
Hmm.
Um, we are the big guy on the block for all of that. Now, that said, remember the Five Eyes. This is an important dimension I hadn't thought of, but Britain is one of the Five Eyes countries, along with Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, and the United States. And Britain has access to a great deal of our intelligence, particularly on the signals side, the
Hmm.
interceptions and so
So,
forth.
so what we see, they see.
What we see, they see almost without restriction. So I don't know how they respond to this directive from the United States. I would think that they ignore it.
Hmm.
In other words, that given that both Macron and the British Prime Minister Sturmer have said that they are considering, open to the idea of putting their troops on the ground as part of some kind of peace agreement yet to be created. I would think the British would want to be providing whatever they've got, um, and that doesn't make up for what the United States does. But here's what it does do: it opens up a breach between us and the British.
Hmm.
We have two Five Eyes partners here who share almost everything, with one saying we're holding back, and the other, I don't know what they're doing, the British. They have to decide whether they're going to follow our lead or not. And that's what's wrong with this whole policy.
Hmm.
When you start doing this, there are only two things that operate at a gross level in international affairs. One is fear and one is trust.
Hmm.
Trust is the hardest thing to get. You get it through cooperation, through long relationships, through putting your hand in the fire together with people. This administration so far is using mainly fear
Hmm.
and sanction, which is what you do with adversaries and as part of deterrence. But I might also add that Canada is part of the Five Eyes agreement, and I don't know precisely what Canada provides to um, Ukraine, but I'm sure it's substantial.
Hmm.
And again, it opens up a kind of odd negotiation or breach with the Canadian partners. So, you know, this isn't exactly what you asked, but it seems to me we are um, running a real risk of breaking trust with our partners around
Is
the
there,
world.
Is there not, just this is a layperson's question again, but is it not also possible that what the United States is trying to have here is, again, if they want to be perceived as honest brokers in this thing, so that let's say a Ukrainian strike a week from today or on this weekend does huge damage to a arms depot or something inside Russia, that the United States can say, well, that intel didn't come from us, right? Even if it might have gone through the route you just described, that, well, it was US intel, but it was the Canadians or the British or somebody else who gave it to Ukrainians.
Well, yes, it makes a certain amount of sense if you're trying to be the honest broker to prevent events that would um, destabilize the kind of balance you're seeking to create. My only concern is we have no idea of whether the United States has simultaneously said to the Russians in some sort of back channel, this could be a way to deal with it, in a back channel of some sort with the Russians, or a front channel for that matter, to say to them, we're not giving Ukraine anything that can hurt you right now in
Mm-hmm.
the way that would be substantial, and you should stop doing whatever you're doing to Ukraine. If
Mm-hmm.
we could bring that off, that would be interesting. But I have no reason to believe, or there's no reporting that we are approaching it that way.
Recognizing excellence in national security, the Cipher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now at cipherbriefhonors.com.
So, just to take a step back then from this intelligence question of the moment, um, so much has happened since we last spoke with you, and clearly the U.S.-Russia engagement now has gone much further than just to cover the war in Ukraine. There's a lot of talks on a lot of other issues. How do you assess um, that level now of U.S.-Russia engagement and its implications?
Well, at one level, it's a good thing to be in touch with the Russians. I've lived through periods when we have had business-like relations with them, I guess would be the term. I've had tea in the Lubyanka and uh, met with them and so forth years ago, during the period prior to Putin. And since Putin, we've had meetings with them in track two settings and so forth. So there's nothing wrong with trying to open up a relationship with them. But the problem here is that the circumstance we're in today is very different from the situation I just described.
Mm-hmm.
That is to say, we can't get around the fact that Russia blatantly and unprovoked invaded another country that it had pledged in 1994 never to invade, and in an agreement to which we were party. Our relationship with them now can't be open-ended, let's sit down and talk. It needs
Mm-hmm.
to be, we can talk, but you understand we have conditions and there are things that we need you to do in order to help us arrive at a settlement that is fair to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
I assume we've said something like that to them, but I don't know. And I was thinking through it today. What are the Russians prepared to give up here? In any kind of settlement involving Russia that is acceptable to us, there have to be, I assume, some kind of security agreements to ensure the Russians don't just continue doing what they're doing in Ukraine. And they could be either bilateral or they could be in some sort of peace agreement that the Europeans work out. And let's assume that the Europeans actually agree to put some forces on the ground. Well, what are the rules of engagement?
Mm-hmm.
Peacekeepers can be, as they were in the early stages of the Balkan Wars, just reporters and kind of referees. That was very ineffective until Clinton got NATO forces into the Balkans in the middle of that decade. So, what are the rules of engagement in a peaceful agreement? Do the forces that are peacekeeping engage the Russians if they violate the agreement? Is the U.S. standing in the background to help with that? All of that has to be worked out. So That's part of the discussion that would need to be going on with the Russians if we've opened up some kind of channel to them.
Well, we know
So
that.
far, we've taken. I'm just everyone has talked about this, but for weeks now, we've basically given away the things that to the Russians, the things that they most ardently desire. Even on this sharing of intelligence, it was a Russian I think parliamentarian who made the statement about 2 or 3 weeks ago that the United States should stop sharing intelligence with Russia, with Ukraine. And lo and behold, we do.
Yeah.
So we seem to be going down the Russian checklist of things that would help them come to the table. Okay, let's get them to the table. I suppose the president and others would say that's the main thing, get them to the table, and then we can deal with all these other things.
Mm-hmm.
But if you've taken so many of these leverage points off the table, what are you left to deal with?
Yeah. Well,
I guess that's how I'm thinking about engaging the Russians right now.
I was just going to say, and it makes your point in a way for you, but the Kremlin has said in the past couple of days that the United States approach now, I think the phrase was, largely coincides with our vision. President Trump was asked about that on Monday, and he said, well, it takes two to tango, to your point. And the fact is, I just want fairness. So I guess it still leaves I'm not sure there's a question there, but it leaves your last point hanging, which is what comes on the other side, right?
Well, we just can't forget what Russia has done in Ukraine. It goes beyond simply invading. Even if you were to make all of the excuses that can be made for the Russians about their resentment of NATO enlargement and so forth, even if you make all those excuses, they've been brutal with that population. They, by any standard, have committed war crimes. And it is not hard for me to understand Zelensky's behavior in the Oval Office. This is a wartime leader who, night and day, for 3 years, has seen his people brutalized.
Mm-hmm.
And to then be kind of slapped down when he says something like, oh, by the way, Putin has already broken 3 ceasefires. There are ways to handle that. One could say, thank you, President Zelensky. We understand your point and we'll wrap that into our deliberations. That would be one way to handle it.
Mm-hmm.
Another way to handle it would be simply to agree with him and say, yes, we understand that. And we'll keep it in mind as we go forward.
Yeah.
But kind of slap him down seems to me a failure to understand what he and that country have been through.
And last question then, John. You wrote for the Cipher Brief, it seems like 100 years ago, but it was just a month ago or so. You wrote for us about what you called the perils of negotiating with Vladimir Putin. And you said at the time that, nothing wrong with, even though some people were against the very idea of just even beginning that process. So much has happened since. You've talked about a lot of it here. What's a point you would make if you were spending a moment with the president before he went off, wherever it may be, for a sit down with Vladimir Putin right now?
I would say the main thing you have to know about Putin is he knows what he wants, and he will come prepared to push hard for what he wants. And so you, Mr. President, have to know well in advance what you want. This isn't a pickup game. It's not improvisational. I think the president, for understandable reasons, given his background and the fact that he's engineered an incredible political comeback, I think he has extraordinary faith in his ability to go into a room and move people, persuade people, bring people along, and so forth. But in dealing with Putin and the Russians generally, Putin in particular, he knows what he wants, and you have to know very clearly what you want, and don't give it away prematurely. We've tended to use a lot of fear and pressure with our allies. You have to use the same fear and pressure with Putin.
Okay. We'll leave it there. No doubt. Well, I shouldn't say no doubt, but presumably a lot more will change in the coming days and weeks. And we always appreciate your insights. John McLaughlin, great to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you, John.